Hi, welcome back to Raising Questions. I'm Dean, and I'm in a mask because that's the current situation. And of course, the show will go on without that. I wish the rest of life could go on without that, but that's the way it is. Today, it's just very personal stuff that I want to get into. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on anything. I just want to express pretty much my personal feelings about what's going on and how people are reacting and what the political situation seems to be and what the threats and the opportunities are in the political situation that we're going through because of the COVID crisis and because, who knows, there are various reasons why we're all having problems. And the first thing I want to do is ask a question, which is in line with the name of the show, Asking Questions. And I'm wondering what it is that everybody's going through. And I went back to a professor friend of mine, not a personal friend, but somebody I know about, Abraham Maslow, who said there are 4 things that everybody needs, and they start with P, S, S, and P, and they start with the physical, and they go on to the safety issues of life, the social issues of life, and then the personal, psychological issues of life. And very quickly to go through that, I mean, many books have been written about this. We're all suffering physically, and that reason is obvious. The reason for saying that is obvious. This is a pandemic. It's a disease that we're talking about. And then we're also talking about safety in the country right now, as it looks like places in Oregon and all over the rest of the United States seem to be threatening to fall apart if you take the media seriously. There is something going on where we're maybe not all worried about our safety, but many of us are. And then our social life has fallen apart. We can't even go out to the stores or restaurants that we're used to and meet people and just see people that we don't even know in order to reassure ourselves that we're part of a society. That's falling apart. And then lastly, the psychological problems are very, very intense. Even there are problems, according to some people, with a rise in the suicide rate, or at least a threat that the suicide rate could go up because of the situation that we're in. So it gets back to also, if that's the personal part of it, gets back to the national question. What kind of country do we want? I ask that because the COVID virus is affecting us all in the country, and I'm interested in politics. And therefore, I brought a book along that I used to read a lot more. Don't read it quite as much today. It's all about the Supreme Court and the Constitution. And the Constitution of the United States gives us some really key answers to the question, what kind of country do we want? The first thing that it hits, I have to don these glasses to be absolutely sure, the first thing that the Constitution talks about is that the people of the U.S. wrote a Constitution through their, you might call them representatives, in order to establish a more perfect union with justice and tranquility and liberty. A union, everybody together, with justice, that explains itself, tranquility, and last of all, liberty. And some of those things don't really fit together. That is the big problem that we're going through right at the moment. And I just want to hit really, really hard that factor of tranquility. The Constitution was not written in order to enhance the possibility that we would have anarchy. It was written in order to try to make sure that we had tranquility and order. And so in Amendment number 1, the First Amendment, the Constitution talks about the right to assemble. And it says quite specifically that people have the right peaceably to assemble, not to assemble and run riot, but peaceably to assemble. And then also the Constitution says in Article 2, which is even more famous, that people have the right to keep and bear arms. However, the first few words in that amendment say we need a well-regulated militia. A well-regulated militia is necessary. So we have over and over again the Constitution hitting the idea that tranquility is very, very important. as well as liberty. And liberty is a fine thing, we're all for that, but it might surprise you to see how much the Constitution emphasizes the goal of tranquility and union. And what we see right now in the United States is pretty much the opposite of that. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, we don't have a very, very detailed Constitution to tell us what to do. The Constitution of the United States is relatively short and basically sets up a government, but it doesn't say what the government is there for, except for some fairly vague, non-detailed ideas. And I've just given you the 3 or 4 that I think are the most important, and really hitting the idea of tranquility and union as hard as possible. Tranquility and union could be summarized maybe in the word harmony, people getting along, the country getting along, and so forth. And what strikes me at the moment is, wow, how are we going to do that in a country that actually is divided to begin with into 50 different parts, actually 51 if you count Washington, D.C., plus there are places like Puerto Rico. So we're divided up into more than 50 different governmental units. Very, very hard to establish harmony, unity, tranquility, liberty, and so forth, with 50 different outfits telling people what to do. Now, what's really annoying at the moment is that the president is saying, I'm going to send federal troops into places like Portland, Oregon, which he has indeed done. That's not the annoying part. That's in the Constitution. The Constitution was written in order to help produce tranquility and union. He has every right, the president, every right to send federal officers into local cities. President Eisenhower did this in the 50s in order to help integrate the schools. He sent the military, not just federal officers, but the military into the South to make sure that black kids could go to school. This is nothing new whatsoever. And the arguments on behalf or made by the Portland mayor and the governor of Oregon are completely and utterly specious, absolutely ridiculous. The president has the power to send in federal officers to try to quell rioting. Again, the Constitution didn't say, we're setting this up for anarchists. You know, we don't like order. We really are in favor, us founding fathers. They were all men. Us founding fathers, we're not in, we can't stand peace and quiet. We're here for anarchy. This is not what happened. Just the opposite. And the federal government has a very big role in making sure, trying to make sure that that occurs. So anyway, it's very, very annoying that that solution to some of the rioting that's going on, the federal solution, has been objected to by local officials. It's completely wrong. And that brings up some other things. Maybe we ought to look at what is the real cause of what is going on. We know that racism has been accused as the #1 problem that we've got to solve. And the horrible things that happened in Detroit, not in Detroit, sorry, but in Minnesota, are an indication of that. I needn't go into the details. And the point seems to be made over and over again now, and this is an illustration again of 50 different ways to do things. According to some people, every white person in the land has to feel guilty in order to be a good person. White privilege, et cetera, is denounced, and white power is denounced, and so forth and so on. I think that some of that is great. You know, my very own ancestors in the South, they lived in the South, thought they owned slaves, actually owned people, and they were upset as the Civil War came to a close that some of their slaves were beginning to rebel. Not good, not good at all. It's obvious that since that occurred about 150 years ago, some people are saying, here's the obvious part, some people are saying that black people should just get over it. It's been a long time since slavery was the law of the land, or the law of the South, well, the law of the land actually, and you ought to get over it. And again, I find that also, that reasoning or that logic is also specious. If you took anybody, any group of people, and kept them in irons and chains and in the cotton fields for a couple hundred years, and then you let them go and said, good luck to your progeny, good luck to your children, well, that would be pretty tough on them. I've been the grateful recipient of the American way. About 300 million people have been the grateful recipient of the American way, partly because of what my parents knew, what their parents knew, what their parents knew, and so forth and so on, going back generations and generations. Just what people knew in my family got passed on to me and my cohorts. And that happened to millions and millions of lucky people in the United States. The African American population, however, did not get that. They did not benefit from generation after generation after generation after generation of knowledge and technique and skills and attitudes. So of course the white population, generally speaking, owes a lot now to the black population, despite the progress that we've made during the past 50 or 60 years. Let me point out something else too, though, that's really annoying. The idea that every white person has to feel totally guilty as if they personally caused the current problems. I can't stand that. That's just not right. How many black senators and black representatives were there in the US Congress, and how many black presidents, when the Civil Rights Act was passed back in the 60s? Just about zero. It was done by the white representatives of white people. They can learn, those white people, absolutely, and they've done a lot of good for everybody in the whole country. This somehow, in my mind, is related to the idea that we used to be a melting pot in the United States. The thing that I learned in second grade was that we have all sorts of immigrants from Italy, Sweden, Mexico, and so forth and so on, and everybody gets together, and it's like throwing food into a so-called melting pot, and you get a stew out of it that is somehow Americana. Everybody blends into the overall concoction. So we have everybody under the American flag, even though they might have come from Italy, Sweden, whatever, or their parents, grandparents, or other ancestors did the same thing. So it used to be that all sorts of immigrants were welcomed here as long as they turned into good Americans. I've been watching The Godfather recently, again, for about the 5th time. It has a lot of answers to what's going on now. And there's a scene in there where Italian Americans in New York are having a festival of some sort. It's a religious festival and an Italian festival. The first thing they do at the festival is open up with a band playing the national anthem. The national anthem. You didn't see a bunch of Italian football players kneeling in the street. Everybody said, yes, indeed, we have become Americans. That's what we have to get back to somehow. And again, I understand the proviso that if you were black, you weren't thrown into the melting pot. You weren't even invited into the kitchen. I understand the stresses and the strains, but I think it's gone far too far in the wrong direction. There is still something okay about being an American, as long as you're allowed to be an Italian American, or in my case, an Irish American, English American. I'm an amalgamation of various people. And that we have to go back to. Now, let's stick with The Godfather for a minute. The Godfather opens up with an Italian American talking to Marlon Brando, who was pretending to be the Godfather, an Italian American. And his guest was saying, I believe in America, but my daughter has just been beaten up, and the thugs who did it to her have been identified, and they were put on trial, and the judge let them go. Just absolutely let them go. Said they were guilty, and then said, you don't have to do any time. You did the crime, that's enough. You don't have to do the time. Well, the Italian-American guest of Marlon Brando is sitting there across from the desk saying, please do something about this. And Brando says, well, I'm not going to murder those guys because they didn't murder your daughter, they beat her up. Well, we know the rest. He hired somebody or appointed somebody to make absolutely sure that justice was done, and that the thugs, who didn't do any time, instead suffered severe injuries. Let's just put it that way. Now, it used to be, I suppose, that if the film is at all accurate, that indeed you could go to somebody like The Godfather and get justice done when the system did not come through with justice and liberty and tranquility and so forth. And that was not a real good system, although it certainly helped some people, like, again, the Italian man whose daughter had been beaten up. What we're getting into right now, unfortunately, is the breakdown of the governmental system. And my question is, will this lead us back to reliance on people like The Godfather, especially in a day and age when almost anybody can be their own godfather? Go out and buy a gun. Just get your own gun. Then you can do justice. And the reason that people have started to do that by rioting and by shooting each other in Chicago and other places is because of this governmental breakdown. At least that's what I suspect. And in the case of a governmental breakdown, eventually you may get a very, very strong leader. They got that, for instance, in Germany in the 1930s. In 1933, Hitler took over. Why? Because the government had broken down. There was mass unemployment, there was crime, there was this, that, and the other thing that only a strong guy could cure. And so I'm worried about whether or not that could happen here. What has happened here that's parallel to that has very little to do with the government, but it reinforces the sad idea that is at the root of our problems, in my opinion. I'm finally getting to the end. The root of our problem is that people feel a sense of powerlessness. I know I certainly do. Just try to call up a big corporation that promises to deliver certain things to you every month if you pay a monthly fee, and frequently it turns out they don't really come through with that. Try to phone them up and have a rational conversation about it. No. What kind of music would you like to hear while we put you on hold? And then we'll get you somebody who may argue with you, or at least tell you that you don't have a case. How many times in history has that kind of situation mushroomed into massive dissatisfaction? Well, again, getting back to the point, in America right now at the moment, I think there's a vast sense of powerlessness by the individual. One of the solutions to that we were promised was, get yourself a personal computer. And then you can become, if you join the internet, you can become part of that worldwide bunch of individuals just like you who will have a sense of personal power. You will be networked into the world. You can do your own TV show, radio show, whatever. You can have your own version of Radio City Music Hall right at home if you feel like it. And everybody's going to be equal and have the same sense of power, and everybody's going to be able to contribute. Well, how long did it take for that dream to explode? In the first place, you got to be pretty handy technically in order to do some of these things. Not all of us are. Not all of us should have to be in the first place. And instead of equality spreading around the world as one person after another joins the network through the internet, what has really happened? Well, about 2 people in Silicon Valley, San Francisco, and maybe in other places too, have become incredibly rich billionaires because of this equality that they promised to everybody. For some reason or other, it hasn't quite worked out. You may have noticed during the crisis even that we've been recently going through, the virus crisis, that if you order something from a company that I won't name, but which has an Amazonian reach, it's about as big as the Amazon jungle. I won't mention the name. If you have tried to order from them recently, you've seen they've used the excuse of the virus. Well, we can't deliver things to you on time the way we used to. And unfortunately, some prices have risen. Why has nobody stepped in to help solve that problem? In the first place, why is there only one virtually or literally Amazonian supply company of the kind that I'm talking about? The government should have stepped in a long time ago to say, there's going to be 2, and they will compete with each other. They will not cooperate much. They will compete. About 100 years ago, there was a president named Theodore Roosevelt who actually did that with regard to oil companies. That's why we have many more oil companies rather than just one giant monopoly. Well, the current government, and I'm not talking about the current president, I'm talking about current presidents reaching way back into history, and including even the current government, has failed to come through on its promise. Getting back to the original point. The original point was, as I was reading, the Constitution promised us tranquility and unity and peace, basically, and liberty. Promised us all of that. Liberty. Well, we don't have too much liberty if we're suffering from the domination of one giant supply firm and one giant, let's say, I can't mention the name of the company, but something in California that is online and has something to do with faces and books. How come so much power is now residing in those high-tech companies, pretty much unsupervised by the Constitution and by the government? I think that the sense of powerlessness that engenders has filtered down to the local level in America. It's been triggered by racial divides, yes, but I think it's much more than that. It's a sense of powerlessness all the way down to the local level, to individuals who feel that they are at the mercy of giant corporations and a few people in Silicon Valley who do not come through on their promise to grant us individual freedom, individual liberty, or even peace and quiet, if we just use their tools and their internet operations. Somehow all of this ties together. And it's a very delicate question, of course, what are we going to do about it? But what I don't want to see is the days that we go back to The Godfather, where you're going to have to find somebody in your neighborhood who looks a lot like Marlon Brando and who promises to go out and beat up the guys who you think are responsible for your troubles. Let's hope we can do better.